In part 1 of discussion 2, we looked at Weitz's critique of theories that proposed necessary and sufficient conditions for a thing of the world to be art versus non-art. In his view, none of the theories were seen to adequately provide criteria. Weitz saw each of the theories as proposing jointly necessary and sufficient conditions, and failing on this account. Let's explore this a bit further. A condition was necessary for a thing to be art, and that condition was sufficient if it applied to all things that could be art. For example, formalists state the condition for a thing to be art is significant form caused by plastic elements coming together to evoke a unique response. The problem that Weitz pointed out using formalist elements as an example was that things normally not considered art, a garbage can or a sponge or a rock, can fit this criteria along with things considered art. Further, while formalist criteria might be obvious in a work such as The Child's Bath by Mary Cassatt, it might not be found in Tom Friedman's artwork titled 1,000 Hours of Staring. This work is a blank piece of paper that Friedman supposedly stared at for 1,000 hours. Should this be considered art? Well, it is now housed in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So what are formalists to do with this information? Again, think of our imaginary circle. Inside the circle are all things that are art, and outside the circle are all things that are not art, and the boundary is the criteria by which we judge. So Weitz asked, what if someone creates something considered art that doesn't fit the criteria? Tom Friedman's paper, for example. It sits outside the circle, but many still consider it to be art. Again, we're still thinking in formalist terms here. So we have a dilemma. We either have to expand our circle to include that new work of art, or we have our original circle and we have to create a new circle with new criteria. So now we have two circles. And in Weitz's view, there was the real possibility that we would have to continually expand our criteria to include new art. To do so would be to create a list without any particular rationale. Weitz then clarified, quote, the problem with which we must begin is not what is art, but what sort of concept is art? And this was a philosophical question. It was a question that asked when the concept art might correctly be applied. Here, Weitz drew upon the work of philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who considered a similar problem. In his philosophical investigations, published posthumously in 1953, Wittgenstein considered the word game. He wrote, quote, consider the activities we call games. I mean, board games, card games, ball games, athletic games, and so on. What is common to them all? End quote. Wittgenstein didn't want us just to say, quote, there's something in common to all games, end quote, because he knew if we looked carefully, we wouldn't find anything common to all of them. Any criteria we come up with fails. For example, we might say a game is always entertaining, but the game could be boring to someone. We might say there's a winner and a loser, competition between players, but then what about bouncing a ball against a wall or playing solitaire? Wittgenstein said that all the things we call games have similarities and differences, and he called these similarities family resemblances. While some games shared aspects, there was no one jointly necessary and sufficient condition to make all activities games. Weitz applied Wittgenstein's idea to the problem of art and said there is no one or set of jointly necessary and sufficient conditions that guarantee a thing is art versus non-art. New cases of art will constantly arise. These will be, quote, new art forms, new movements will emerge. Its conditions can never be exhaustively enumerated since new cases can always be envisaged or created by artists or even nature, end quote. Now let's turn to the practice of applying value judgments onto art to see how all these theories discussed with respect to Weitz play a role. Recall Collingwood and his presuppositions. If we can locate the presuppositions someone holds about what makes art, then we can better see the reasons for the way they value art, and this is extremely important. For example, the art critic Clement Greenberg held aspects of formalism and emotionalism. For him, great art manipulated formal elements to evoke emotion. This alignment influenced his value judgments. Art that evoked emotions was good. On the other hand, kitsch, that he listed as things like popular culture, commercial art, magazine covers, pulp fiction, comics, etc., was possibly not real art. His presuppositions about necessary and sufficient conditions for art directly translated into value or quality. Similarly, when someone expresses a value judgment about a work of art, or art generally, we can inquire into the presuppositions about necessary and sufficient conditions. For example, if someone says, "This art works," a common phrase in art school critiques, the person may presuppose both formalist and organicist criteria. This is why I say that part of our job as artists is to look for underlying presuppositions, or as Robin Collingwood said, quote, "to untangle all this mess," end quote.